Okay, I'm on speaker now. Hello, thanks for coming. What I wanted to talk to you about today is I'm going to broaden out the debate a little bit. You heard from Robert, you had a nice overview of why people should bother voting and different voter patterns that have taken place in the UK. But I wanted to now take the opportunity to look a little bit further afield. You can see from the title, The Outraged, how and why young people are reshaping democracy in the European Union. Where the word outrage comes from, it literally comes from protests that you had in France, in Spain, Indignados, or apologies for the Spanish accent, but that's how I pronounce it, and the youth protests that you've had across the world. So far from saying that young people are not interested in politics, which is, if you listen to the media, if you look on your TVs, that's the general impression that you're given. I would make the point that young people are very interested in politics. They're not just interested in the politics that we were hearing is delivered by politicians. So they're dissatisfied with the political system, but they're actually interested in politics. And one of the clearest indications of this is probably, and I think me and Robert both quite grateful about this, is that young people still are interested in politics because they're doing politics degrees. Politics A-levels have been increasing over the past 10, 15, 20 years. It's one of the, it was at least until about a year or so ago, one of the largest growing subjects at A-level in this country. So people, young people in particular, who I'm focusing on, are interested in politics and they're reshaping it in their own style. The problem that we have, from my perspective, is the disconnection between young people and their politics and electoral politics as it's delivered by politicians, parties, political systems. The UK is particularly bad at this. If you look at it from a European perspective, some countries, we always say the Scandinavians seem to be good at everything, but they're good at politics as well. They're good at deliberative democracy. And in the UK, we're particularly bad, and youth turnout in the UK is particularly low. And the disconnection, I mean, if you look at the difference between young people voting in the UK and older people, it's the difference between the two is larger than in almost any other European country, and that's worrying for the future of democracy, and this is the problem that I'm going to talk about. However, first thing to illustrate is that why is youth special? Why are young people important? And when I look at young people, I tend to look at 15 to 24-year-olds. Obviously, only people over 18 can have a vote in this country. But really, we're talking about the next generation of politics and what happens in people's first opportunity to vote. So if you decide, right, general elections coming up, I'm deciding not to vote, that tends to be the pattern that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Or if you decide I'm voting Conservative, that could be, you'll tend to vote Conservative for the rest of your life. So your first political experience of voting will stay with you and become a pattern. So this is why it's particularly worrying in the UK that you have low electoral participation of young people. However, I'm not saying that it's the fault of young people, and I'll go on to speak about that later. The issue that, I mean, if you look at the pictures up there, you have, I think that's Central Square in Madrid, the Occupy protests, a lot of green issues. It was very interesting if you looked at the London riots and what happened after the London riots. You had a very quick social network campaign that led to the clean-up operation in a couple of days. So all of the negative press about young people, well actually, if you look at the response from mostly young people, it's also quite positive. So maybe young people aren't, and maybe for rational reasons that we heard earlier, aren't interested in the sort of politics that they're delivered. And in Britain, you don't necessarily have a great choice of politics. Another country that I look at, for example, is Germany. Now, German politics is sometimes a bit boring, but what they do at least have is you do have a wider spectrum of political parties and opportunities for engagement in that particular country. So the Green Party, for example, is quite big in Germany. You can vote for Green Party. You have a proportional representation type of system, and so in some ways you can feel you do have an alternative vote, and your vote does count. But let's look at this youth activism in more detail, because we have, as most of you know, had a financial crisis. It's hitting local government, it's hitting European democracies all over the place, but young people are most exposed to that global financial crisis. And this is one of the reasons why you've had such a growth in youth activism across Europe, okay, in America, against greedy bankers, against corrupt politicians in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal. You've seen the protests in Turkey, and you've seen protests in Brazil as well for slightly different reasons. But 2011 in particular was a year of protest against high youth unemployment, against politicians who weren't listening, and against the economic and political marginalisation of young people. From my perspective, it's not the fault of young people that they're not engaged as much, certainly in this country. It's the fault mostly of political systems, and you can see this. When it comes to the global financial crisis, it's youth services that get hit, it's student tuition fees that go up, whereas, for example, to take a good example from this country, you don't even have means testing for the fuel benefit that you get if you're a pensioner or for older people, whereas these benefits are taken away from young people. And one of the reasons for this is the reason that we heard earlier, is that simply young people don't vote. If they don't vote, politicians don't listen to them. So there's a real problem here in terms of the marginalisation of people, young people in particular, and so the reasons for them not voting may actually be quite good. Is political participation important? Well, as I've said, I think young people do it. There's more volunteering. If you look at campuses, my campus at Royal Holloway is just one example, but I've heard that this is true across the country, and volunteering has increased a lot on campuses over the past 10, 15, 20 years. So possibly these forms of civic engagement, which are alternative to voting, have in some ways taken the place of electoral politics, but then again you still have the problem that if you don't vote, then people don't take notice of younger people or groups that don't vote. Social and economic changes. There are some other good reasons for young people not voting. Voting, and we know this from various political studies, is people don't identify with political parties as they did 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they think more about issues. That's fine. But political parties haven't really adapted to that. So it's more about these big appeals, and it's not about these specific issues. And this is why certain issue-based parties arise all the time. Green environmental parties, you could argue in the UK that UKIP as a single issue party, although if you're a smaller party in the UK, you don't tend to get much seats. So the electoral logic, if you like, is against you. But in other countries, you have various single issue groups arising at different times. And this is the sort of politics that younger generations, so not only the very young, are more in tune with. However, should say that there is an issue of demographic decline as well. The number of younger people within society has become smaller. So for politicians, it's more attractive to try and appeal to the older voters, not only because they vote more, but also because there's more of them, and there'll continue to be more of them for the foreseeable future. And the problem with young people is, if young people don't vote, smaller proportion of young people, politicians don't listen to them as much, their issues get ignored, and so you have, there were demonstrations of young people against student tuition fees in this country, but those demonstrations, as we know, fell upon deaf ears, and it wasn't, I don't think the media particularly supported it, and older people didn't necessarily support the protests either. So just a couple of graphs which I'll go through really quickly. So as this is really just to illustrate that falling voter turnout is not just a British phenomenon. However, it's worse in Britain than almost any other EU 15 countries. These are the old countries of the European Union before we had enlargement in 2004. So Western and Central Europe, more or less. Voting has declined over this period, but voting isn't everything. People are getting involved in different things, be it lobby groups, issue groups. NGOs, non-governmental organisations, over the past 10, 20 or 30 years have absolutely proliferated. People become more involved in issue groups, consumer activism, all different types of politics that are not necessarily to do with political parties. But once again, the disconnection between citizens and political parties and voting does matter. This is interesting, and perhaps I'll explain why. So the 3 lines up there is a percentage of 15 to 24-year-olds in the European population, and the figure lower down is the 18 to 24-year-olds, i.e. the ones who can actually vote. So that's declining. You have an increase in older people in society, older voters. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because when you come to the what was called the Arab Spring, so the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa, what you actually see is a really large proportion of young people. And why this matters is because where young people embody a large proportion of the electorate, or where they embody a large proportion of society, when you have things like youth unemployment, etc., and that big body of young people get frustrated, then dramatic political events occur. And I saw one really interesting study saying that what was happening in the Middle East and North Africa, the Arab Spring, was obviously about unemployment and economic slowdowns, but it's also about the demographic rise in the new generation. So maybe that perhaps explains why young people have been marginalised as well. However, as I've said before, people have talked about a democratic deficit, but I think other people have talked about what's been termed the democratic phoenix. People in general, young people in particular, are just doing politics differently. And it's for politicians and political systems to try and work out, well, how can we connect with that new style of politics that's taking place now? People identifying with issues. How can you make it... People also have become more, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, efficacious. What that means is they want to see, if they're voting or they're getting engaged in a community, they want to see the results of their engagement. So if you can get engaged with a local council and you're trying to get, I don't know, bus fares down, you want to see something happen. And this is why politics, this is why it's important that we're having this event here, why politics can perhaps most effectively take place now at a local level, because people actually can see the fruits of their own action, and I think that this is really important. However, a note of caution, within this society where voting has become less and people are getting more involved in issues, it tends to be people from the more educated, privileged classes who are taking advantage of that. This is why I take issue, this is where it gets slightly political, but I don't think that's a bad thing, with the big society, because if you look at big society and this idea of people getting more involved in their local communities, well, yeah, that's fine, and it's a good thing that people get involved in their local communities, but you also then have a problem with the issue of what sort of person is getting engaged, and it tends to be people from more privileged backgrounds. This is why a big society works better in Windsor, which is quite near where I live, than it does in Slough. So, you know, those sorts of ideas work better in different places, and here's a bit of an example of what I mean. These are the types of politics that have become more popular since the 1980s. So we saw in Robert's charts how voting was becoming less popular. Once again, this is across the EU, but this is true for every EU country. That signing a petition, getting involved in a boycott, attending a demonstration, these are forms of politics that have become more popular. So if you broaden out the definition a little bit. Also, going back to the surveys that we heard in Robert's presentation, I mean, I agree with him. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just that people are disaffected with politics. If you go a little bit deeper, it's about politicians and political parties and the political system, whereas there may be some political issues that people are really passionate about. One way of explaining this, and this is what one theorist talks about, is this idea that people are interested in the politics that affects their everyday life. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, you might go out in your massed ranks of your class, you felt like you're part of the working class, You'd go out and vote for the Labour Party as part of your class act, if you like. Nowadays, it's just not the same thing. The politics has to touch your everyday life, and this is why local politics, if local politicians and local politics generally is empowered, which it's not sufficiently in this country at least, then it can have a real bearing, because people at a local level can do something that will affect your everyday life. And the everyday life explanation also explains why you have all these Spaniards going out to protest in Madrid, because you have youth unemployment approaching 50%. Okay, so it's something that touches their everyday life. They know what the problem is. It's quite clear to them, and they want to protest. I'm not going to go into this table in too much detail. It's just the table that I had at hand. What I wanted to point that I was making here really is that there are these types of political action down the bottom that younger people do get involved in. But I also wanted to point out that it's partly a class issue as well. It's not just about young people, old people voting, not voting. It's about class. When you come from privileged class, middle class background, you're much more likely to vote or get involved in politics more generally. So it's easy in one way, and I sometimes do this, to talk about young people not getting engaged in politics, people not getting engaged in politics, but it's also quite dangerous, because as we move away from electoral politics, you can see actually that electoral politics is quite equal amongst different classes. And we move to new forms of politics, which do exist, they are less equal. So signing a petition, getting involved in a demonstration is much more something, it's less something that the lower classes will do, more something that the higher classes would do generally. This is why, another reason why voting is so important, because voting is a very socially equal act. Well, it is in this country, in Europe, it's not in the United States, but that's another conversation. Discussion, implications. I've got another 5 minutes. So good. Political participation in Europe, democratic deficit or democratic phoenix. My personal point of view is that politics is there, it's taking place, and it's easy to go out there in a survey and say, well, you know, do young people vote, or do they do this, or do they do that? But this is one of the reasons why I have issues sometimes with numbers and surveys, because maybe you want to go out there and find out what people are doing and not what they're not doing, if you see what I mean. And you might get a slightly different and more positive picture of what's taking place. There is a huge untapped potential of less privileged people. People from poorer backgrounds tend to participate whilst they're young, become more detached as they grow older. Now this is really interesting, because it seems to suggest that whilst people are at school, whilst they're at university, whilst they're socially embedded, if you like, and they have these social institutions to help them, then actually class doesn't make that much of a difference. So schools, what it shows is schools, universities, etc. can have an impact, and this is why personally I'm such a big supporter of things like citizenship education. But there is an issue of economic inequality. If you look at the countries in Europe that have higher participation, they tend to be the ones who have more consensual political systems, like the Scandinavian countries, coming back to them, and more equal societies. And we can't really avoid talking about that issue. But perhaps for young people, economic inequality is less important at the moment than social mobility. And there's this big commission report coming out, and I think they delayed it because they didn't want it to mix with the party conference season, but it's coming out on social mobility and child poverty in the UK. Social mobility in the UK is one of the worst in Europe, certainly the worst in Western Europe. It's worse than the United States. You're more likely in Britain to be in the bottom 10% of earners, or non-earners if you like, if you don't have a job. You're more likely to be in the sort of same bracket as your parents than you are in almost any other country in the Western world. And this is a real problem which is acknowledged by all political parties, to be fair. So it's a broader societal issue as well, because if you come from a less privileged background and you don't think that you're part of society or part of democracy, well, what's the point of engaging in this thing called democracy, which doesn't deliver for me anyway and doesn't give me any opportunities? So that's a more political point. However, for today and for rejuvenating democracies, some ideas for you. Institutional scaffolding, what do I mean by that? Well, political parties, no one's really a member of political parties. Their membership has nosedived dramatically over the last 20, 30 years in this country. It's gone down by, I'm just trying to think of the figures in my head, I can't quite remember, but they're about a third of what they were 20 years ago, I think, in the UK. And you hear all these sort of statistics about, people are more likely to be, members of the AA than they are of a political party. Well, actually, they're much more likely to be members of the AA. Think of a smaller group. But political party membership is nosedived. Almost no one's there. So what do you have? Who's socialising people politically? Well, obviously their family, their friends, mostly, and that's become increasingly important, and their parents. But schools and universities can play a role. So that might be something for you to think about today. The roles that schools and universities can play in engaging young people in politics. And do they, from your experiences that you've had quite recently, have they done it well? Because I've spoken to a lot of people about citizenship education, and they generally say, well, I didn't even know I was being taught it in schools, because the way that it's delivered. And universities don't really seem to do much. I mean, some of you are probably learning politics. Obviously, you do get that sort of knowledge about politics, but for everyone else in universities, they don't really seem to do much. But if you go to the US, you can bet that they do a hell of a lot there. Inclusion in local democracy. There must be a better way of increasing ties between citizens and local democracy. Partly it's a system failure in the UK of local democracies not having enough power and their budgets being reduced and things like that. But partly there must be sort of ways and mechanisms through this sort of event, but through other sorts of initiatives, through which you can increase connections between communities, young people as well, and democracy. And obviously James will know much more about what's happening on that than I would. But something else which I thought you might want to have a think about is also the votes at 16 issue. You may or may not know that in the Scottish referendum that's taking place next year, I can't remember the date of it, Scottish referendum on whether they want to remain part of the UK, 16-year-olds will be able to vote for the first time, really, I think, in the UK. Certainly in large-scale elections. It does take place in some countries. In Austria, 16-year-olds can vote. In a few other countries around the world, you do get it. But lowering the voting age, having more young people, is that right? Are 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds ready to vote, or would it actually create more problems because that group would be even less likely to vote than older people? So maybe that's something for you to consider, because you're a lot more likely to be experts in what 16 and 17-year-olds can do than I am. But I'll leave it there, and I think we'll sort of be moving on to the discussion soon. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Just going past the fire and brimstone slide for a minute. Oh, there we are. There's a little house. There we are. I think there's some really interesting stuff there from Rob and James, and whether there's a phoenix or a crisis, I can't quite work it out myself personally. But scaffolding is an interesting concept, which we could debate. Over the next half hour or so, what we want to do is break you up into teams, and I'm going to do that in a very undemocratic way, I've decided. I'm going to do that in a very dirigiste way. I'm going to have you 5 folks over there. You can introduce yourselves to each other. You can be team number 3. Okay? Then, there's 4 folks here. You'll be team number 2. Okay? Happy with that? And then the remaining 4 at the back there, you can be team number 1. Okay, we'll give you a nameplate. It'll be official. Don't worry about it. We've got 4 questions which are designed really as prompts. Okay, to get you thinking about some of the issues, some of the topics that we've heard about so far. We're going to give you half an hour or so just to come up with a very exciting 3-minute pitch. Okay, so whether you do that collectively, or you nominate an individual or elect an individual, see what I did there? Amongst your group to do that, that's up to you. But what we want you to come back with is a 3-minute pitch to try and address some of the questions that we're going to throw at you. Remember that the best pitch, the winning team, get a fabulous prize. So I've already outlined what that is. It's not a Lexus, unfortunately. Budget doesn't run to that. But it is a year's subscription to Political Insight magazine, which is well worth having. So we'll be on hand to help and to come along, facilitate your bits of discussion. You might have questions you want to ask from James or Rob or from Ian and myself. And Rob and Larissa over there, you can wave now. There they are. They're over there to help. There should be some paper and pens and all those kind of things. So before we dive headfirst into that, has anyone got any questions about the quick challenge exercise that we're going to do, or indeed any questions for Rob or James in terms of the things that they raised? You're going to get stunned silence now. Well, there's a question.
So I'd like to ask James if he thinks that one of the reasons for which, let's say, lower classes engage less in political participation than upper classes would be that there is no actual political party that represents nowadays the interests of the lower classes. They don't feel that there is anyone that would represent their interests.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, a lot of people have said one of the reasons why people don't vote is because of the lack of choice, and the lack of choice is particularly bad in Britain, partly because of the first past the post system. But yeah, I mean, certainly not just in Britain, but in countries like Spain, where parties of centre-left and centre-right are both agreeing on these austerity measures, right? And then there's no political, and the problem with that is not only that you stop, that maybe people from the lower class don't vote, but maybe that they would turn to more extremist political parties. And if you look at the National Front in France, a large proportion of their support is from young people, but also from people with poorer backgrounds. There's a populist left party in Greece, his name's Syriza, or I can't remember. Yeah, thank you. And there's also Golden Dawn, which we've heard a lot about in the news in Greece, populist parties, even in lovely Scandinavia, which is praised so much. You have sort of these far-right parties. So yes, I mean, I do think that centre-left parties and centre-right parties have, there's not much to choose between them at the moment. And this is why, yeah, people from a lower class in particular might not want to vote. I agree.
It was a very good question. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to break out now into our teams. We're going to try not to trip over that. We're going to break out into our teams. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to give team